Episode 80 is a follow up of episode 79. So I kindly request you to first listen to episode 79 to connect with our discussion in episode 80. Thank you and enjoy this episode. I believe we have mostly covered now the most of the points I think that I'm going to ask you about. But yeah, little bit if you can extend more on the same. Uh, so how do geopolitical rivalries such as the US-China relationship shape the future of space exploration? Because I believe still on some levels, China still remains one of the countries which has kind of a footprint in the supply chain, and I think that's the reason even in the Pacific, India, US, Japan, and Australia have come together to basically kind of reduce dependence on China. And I believe several countries, including several of the European nations as well, are still one or the other way are dependent on the Chinese basically supply chain, or some kind of collaborations. So basically how this relationship, which was once kind of a good partnership, but now it has turned into a rivalry due to geopolitical issues. So how does it basically shape the future of space exploration from your perspective?
Shockingly, the US-China relationship is complicated, and
Yeah.
it's complicated on Earth. It's complicated in space. So this is not, I guess, unexpected. Um,
Yeah.
there are some, I guess, congressional, I won't say restrictions, but limitations, speed bumps, if you will, in terms of how much the United States can do with China bilaterally, via NASA, the White House, or the National Space Council and their counterparts in China. And this is a thing called the Wolf Amendment, which dates back to actually 2011. So well over a decade ago, when a congressional representative, Frank Wolf, was concerned about what he saw as Chinese treatment of religious minorities. As well, he was concerned about IP safety, and then cyber intrusions from Chinese activists. And so he did this thing where he supported this legislation, as which has been renewed every year, with congressional legislation, which basically says that the United States can cooperate with China, but it has to do these things first. And again, this is bilateral cooperation. So it has to, when it wants to do something with China bilaterally, this is NASA, White House, um, now the National Space Council, it has to ensure that they're not working with any human rights violators. They have to notify the FBI ahead of time. They have to alert Congress a certain period ahead of time. Um, and then they have to report back. So it isn't saying that they can't, it just makes it complicated. And so I know that there are a lot of US entities that are concerned about, well, if we do something with China, and like non-governmental US entities, they're concerned if, well, if we do something with China, somehow we'll get bumped up against the Wolf Amendment, and then we won't be able to do stuff with the US government, and we better not risk it. So there's a lot of self-censorship in terms of what sort of things they can do. Um, Now, it does not limit, and the United States has had some talks about putting payloads on Chinese rovers and that sort of thing. But it does send a message, right? And it's something where you have these two major space powers, and one is mandated pretty much not to be able to work with the other on certain activities unless these series of things are met. So I think that, and one of the things we always get asked is, hey, is the US ever going
Yes.
to get rid of the Wolf Amendment? That's one of those things that is would require a tremendous amount of political capital to get rid of, and I don't think there's a lot of interest in doing so. Um, the way it is really interesting to see how much the pendulum has swung in terms of China within U.S. Space circles. We go from where the NASA administrator, and at this point, and during the Obama administration, it was Charlie Bolden. The NASA administrator was making multiple trips to China with the idea of eventually getting them into the International Space Station. So actively seeking out cooperation with China in space. And then the Wolf Amendment was put to kind of halt, or at least slow that down. So we have a point where the NASA administration was, let's say, a strong
Yes.
enthusiast of U.S.-China space cooperation, to one where the current NASA administrator Bill Nelson has talked about China being the biggest threat, and
Yeah.
is very concerned. And some of that may be just because it plays well to Congress and it's a good way to get increased budget. But I think it does just kind of indicate where the U.S. is on this, at least again how they view the Chinese. a lot of people in the U.S. national security establishment view the Chinese as doing all their actions in space against the United States,
Yes.
and so if they're doing something on the moon, well, clearly it's a provocation that they're trying to, assert
Yes.
control of the territory, what have you. And while I don't disregard the messaging from national prestige perspective of scientific capabilities and military capabilities, I think it's foolish to overlook, that China has its own domestic messaging and discussions, and people has to win over, and it has other reasons to be doing things in space other than just to defeat the United States. Um, but so I think that's going to be a complicating factor for how we look at future space exploration. If there's something binding that prevents active U.S. Chinese cooperation, that's going to be an issue. You have this sense of concern and lack of clarity in terms of what the Chinese are doing with their space program. And so that affects people, the U.S.'s willingness to work with China. And then finally, one of the things that I think is really interesting is, I mentioned earlier the Artemis Accords, which is, how the U.S. views future, space exploration. It's encouraged other countries to sign on to these accords. Again, non-legally binding, just saying, hey, these are principles that we think are important, should be carried out. 43 countries have signed on to the Artemis Accords. Um,
Yeah.
China and Russia have the International Lunar Research Station, which they've released their, like, okay, here's, technically how you can cooperate with us, but they haven't released anything similar, like in terms of, okay, what are the ILRS principles? What would be how do they envision, peaceful exploration, and what are their priorities, and what are they going to emphasize? Um, since the Artemis Accords were pulled out of the Outer Space Treaty, and China and Russia both signed the Outer Space Treaty. I mean, and they're working with the same laws of physics that we are. I wouldn't imagine that they
Yes.
would be that different, but still, it's important sometimes just to spell these things out and say these are our values, and here's what we want to do.
Yes.
And China and Russia have gotten, I think, about 11 countries to sign on the National Lunar Research Station. So there's a big difference there. So, I mean, I think this complicated U.S.-Chinese relationship, there's a possibility for it making Artemis Accords and the International Research Station, they could be complementary efforts, or they could be competitive efforts, or they could be, you know, um, contested efforts. I hope it won't be the last. I don't think it necessarily needs to be at that point, but it could be.
Yes.
So I guess we'll have to wait and see.
Interesting. And, I think speaking about the threats and the kind of an assessment that you have mentioned about, the Chinese US China relationship, I'd like to go a little bit more towards the threats part. So, can you extend on the nature of threats to space capability and also discuss Secure World Foundation's global counter space threat assessment?
I would be delighted to discuss the Secure World Foundation's Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. Thank you for asking.
Yeah.
So our Global Counterspace Threat Assessment is a publication that we put out every year. I'm the co-editor of it. We've been doing it since 2018. And it's the idea that, the reason why we started it was when you're talking about space issues, it gets classified very quickly. Um, Even more so than nuclear issues, which I used to work on, which I think is unexpected. So we would read stories about what China here in the West, we would read stories about what China and Russia were doing. And it would be kind of like, okay, either hyperbolic, extrapolation in terms of what it means, they did this test, and here's what we think it could be for their entire program. Or it would be kind of like, oh, if only you knew, we can't talk because it's classified, but if only you knew, realize there's a threat and we need to develop U.S. capabilities accordingly. And so we were like, well, what can we find out, from an unclassified viewpoint? Because I don't have clearance. Just from reading newspapers and, doing research about, these activities, and saying, okay, well, what do we know about them? What don't we know? And we make a real effort to explain that in our counterspace report. And then, saying, okay, here's what we know about their policies or their strategies, their budget, their statements. How does this tie into that? And, holistically, how does it compare to other countries? Um,
Yeah.
with the goal of, again, providing kind of an objective assessment of these sort of capabilities. Um,
Yeah.
So when we started this again in 2018, we did 6 countries: U.S., Russia, China, India, Iran, North Korea. And when we started it, we had an internally insecure role. We had a big discussion about whether we should include the United States, um, because it was concerned maybe the U.S. security establishment wouldn't like it and would use it, and would just discredit the report. But in the end, we decided that it was important to include the United States in there as a way of having a holistic conversation of the entire space environment and threats to it. Because I won't say that one drives the other, but actions by one country absolutely do have ramifications and ripple effects and decision makings by the rival countries. So we did those 6 countries, and now we're actually up to 12 countries. We've got Australia, France, Japan, I already said India, South Korea, and the UK, and Israel. Israel was added this year. So you can see in the space of about 6 years, we've doubled the amount of countries that we included on this. So I think that's just an indication of the proliferation of interest in counter space capabilities. Every year we've got 1 or 2 countries we're keeping an eye on. Like, for example, as I said, Israel was added this year. We've had an eye on them for a couple of years. I'm like, nope, this year is Israel's year, based on jamming happening in Gaza, but also they had a test of their missile defense system that was an exo-atmospheric intercept. And we said, well, technically that could be an anti-tank. It's not, but I mean, technically anything that can do an interception outside the Earth's atmosphere could provide a counter space capability. So what we do is we look at 5 different categories of counter space capabilities. And there are different organizations that do their own assessments, and they have different ways of looking at it. We do these 5. The first is co-orbital, with the idea that the spacecraft or a satellite or interceptor, whatever you want to call it, gets into orbit and then does whatever it's going to do at that point. So it's either going to, maybe spy on a satellite, jam it, maybe release projectiles at a high velocity, get near it, anything like that. So that's co-orbital. Then we look at direct ascent, with the idea that the interceptor, and I think is what people traditionally think of when they think of space weapons or counter spaces, direct ascent, anti-satellite capabilities, with the idea that you're launching intercept for somewhere on Earth, whether it's on the ground, in air, from the ocean, and it's an interceptor that is targeted against the satellite, and it's the idea that it directly impacts it and destroys it. And then then we look at directed energy weapons, things like microwave, lasers that could be used to dazzle or blind optical sensors. If you heard news stories this spring about Russia possibly developing a nuclear warhead or its EMP that can use an anti-satellite capacity, this would be included as a directed energy weapon, things like that. Then we talk about electronic warfare, jamming, spoofing, which everyone does. And then we have cyber, which is interesting because cyber counter space is difficult to find information on in unclassified context. And so we have our counter space report is a series of country chapters on those other 4 ones. And then we have like a cyber one at the end where we say, look, these countries have space programs, they have cyber programs. We assume they probably have some sort of cyber counter space capabilities, and we go into some detail on that. There have been only a few cases where it's been very obvious there have been cyber counter space capability or actions that were discussed in an open source way. When Russia invaded Ukraine, for example, in February 2022, they did a simultaneous attack against Viasat's ground terminals with the idea a cyberspace attack, and so the idea that they would interfere with Ukrainian military communications. So that's one open source point of that. Another thing we look at as well is looking at space situational awareness, or SSA capabilities, by each country. Again, there are many reasons why you would want to be able to keep track of objects in orbit. A lot of them are non-military nature, but if you are intending on targeting other countries' satellites, you do need to have some sort of SSA capabilities. That's why we include that. So that's kind of the big picture. Here's what it is, and here's what we're trying to do. And so that you asked me about, okay, what is the threat? Kind of the thing that I would say is that there are destructive and non-destructive counter space capabilities. If you look at active military conflicts, the only counter space capabilities that are currently being used are non-destructive. Things like jamming, things like spoofing, that's even cyber, things like that. We haven't seen any destructive counter-space capabilities being used in conflicts. But as I said before, there's a proliferation of interest, um, and we have this great chart. We call it our stoplight chart, where we have all the countries on the x-axis, and the y-axis we have the various counter-space capabilities. And it's a highly technical. Red means none. Yellow, I mean, some. Red means we know they're doing a lot. Yellow means some, and green means we're not sure they're doing anything. And so if you look at it, there's a lot of activity. Everyone has SSA capabilities of some sort. Everyone has some sort of electronic warfare capability. But as you get to the more
Yes.
offensive capabilities in terms of like directed energy or co-orbital or DASAT, those are, more likely to be, the countries that have done destructive anti-satellite tests. And those
Yes.
countries are, the United States, which did the first first anti-satellite test in 1959, Russia/Soviet Union, which did theirs in 1963. China did theirs. Let's say officially the one that made create debris was in 2007. They had a couple earlier ones, but they didn't create debris. And then India did theirs in
Yes.
2019. So you tend to see the more active, stuff happening there. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of, and
Absolutely.
I could talk about specifics, but those are the sort of things that we're looking at.
Absolutely. And I mean, you mentioned about the space debris and I think the related issues. So I'd like to basically, focus a little bit on the space debris part because that's one of the prime issues, I think, of the recent time. So, from your perspective, can international relations help mitigate space debris and the related global issues, which are, kind of very much harmful for the industry in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think it is possible. You know, um, One of the things I'll bring up is this commitment not to conduct destructive anti-satellite missile tests, which is, it's unilateral, but we saw it multilateralized in the UN General Assembly resolution from a few years ago. It's been brought up, the idea of deliberately creating debris in orbit as being an irresponsible action. It's been brought up in these UN discussions about what's considered responsible behavior. And so again, that's international relations. We're bringing up topics that are definitely of interest. We have this, again, nerding out. We have a wonderful table in our counter-space report. We have a great table, table 5.1, which talks about all the anti-satellite tests that we know that created debris and says, okay, here's the test, here's the date, here's the amount of trackable debris that was created. And that's an important distinction because, of all the there's a lot of debris that's too small to track, but could still be dangerous. And of that trackable debris, how much of it is still around today? And so there's debris
Yes.
from tests over 50 years ago that's still around. Since the dawn of the space age, there's been over 6,800 pieces of trackable debris created from tests, and of those, over 3,000 are still around. And so that's a danger. That's a danger to all actors in space. Frankly, I'll use the space data because this debris is agnostic in terms of who it approaches. You could be an ally of the country that conducted the test, but guess what? If your satellite's near that debris, unless you move, you're gonna, have projection, possibly lose it. I would point out, Russia had their director sent anti-satellite test in November 2021. It created over 800 pieces of trackable debris, and for the next year or so, they had a series of close approaches to other countries' satellites. They called it conjunction squalls because they were having thousands of close approaches, and during very close timeframes over the course of about a week or so. And it was to the point where pretty much every single satellite that was a remote sensing satellite in some synchronous low Earth orbit was having issues with this. And again, it's not just,
Yeah.
competitors, Russia, everyone is. So, I mean, that's a real concern because,
Yeah.
if you create this debris in orbit, right now there are options and actions working towards doing active debris removal, but no one, not even the most enthusiastic support of active debris removal, is saying we are developing a technology that will be able to clean up 3,000 pieces of debris from one incident. Like no one's saying that. It's more a matter of, hey,
Yes.
we might get this big piece of satellite or might be able to collect a couple little pieces of debris, but nothing like that. So, I mean, there's this threatening capability that's out there that a lot of countries are saying, they want to not do anymore. And this is relevant because pretty much every single person on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. And so everyone has an incentive to make sure that the space environment is not disrupted and interfered with, and, having these issues such as creating debris. So that's something that I think international relations is really helping with in terms of, making space environment safer for all.
Interesting. And yeah, as we spoke about, the conflicts and the kind of related international relations conversation. So, from your perspective, what are the challenges and opportunities for space diplomacy in the current geopolitical climate?
Um, so I think there's a real issue right now with Russia.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm
Yes.
stating the obvious there. Um,
Yeah, yeah.
they have particularly over the past couple of years, but they've not been acting, I would say, in good faith in a lot of these international discussions, either in space security or in space sustainability. And so that's been a real challenge um, for moving forward on that. I think oftentimes we in the West tend to look at Russia and China being two sides of the same coin. And certainly they do have some similar viewpoints. They've both been promoting this, for example, this treaty since 2008, this draft treaty. It's called the Prevention of Placement of Weapons in Outer Space. It's not a great treaty because it's the idea that you want to you see the biggest threat as actual design weapons being placed in space, and the way to get rid of that threat is to legally ban them. Which unfortunately for a lot of space capability, a lot of space technology are so dual use, it's really hard to define, okay, what exactly is a weapon? It's hard to verify if weapons are placed in orbit. And it's just not really dealing with the biggest threat there are to space capabilities. The US and its allies tends to look at more as, okay, we're looking at actions. Those are the concerning things. And, whether or not we have a treaty, we can
Yes.
do norms of behavior and that'll help out. Um, so yeah, so Russia and China are kind of on the same page, but in terms of that, but like Russia has been promoting what they call no first placement of weapons in space for almost a couple decades now. And I don't think China has actually made that commitment. You know, when we talked earlier about the idea of Russia, the concern about Russia possibly developing some sort of nuclear warhead that could be put into orbit, which would be against the Outer Space Treaty. The Outer Space Treaty is very clear. Article 4: no weapons of mass destruction may be placed in orbit. And the U.S. and Japan did a resolution in the Security Council this spring, basically saying,
Yes.
reminding countries of their outer space treaty obligations. We encourage countries not to develop these sort of weapons of mass destruction and be placed in orbit. Um, Russia vetoed the resolution, which, again, no surprise. But China abstained. And I found that very interesting because they could have vetoed, you know, they knew the Russians were going to, so it wasn't like they would have been the spoilers, and they could have done it to show, BRIC solidarity and that sort of thing. But they abstained. And so I think there's some space between them on these issues. So I think that is an opportunity for possibly
Yes.
getting some forward momentum on some of these topics in space diplomacy.
Yeah. And, I would say talking about the treaties and related programs that brings in this collaboration, as you mentioned, between Russia and China. So, what role do international alliances like, it's though non-binding, I would say, both ILRS and Artemis, but programs like this, like Artemis Accords, how do they play a role in shaping the future of space exploration?
Well, I mean, things like the Arms Accords, it's interesting because Arms Accords is not necessarily the Artemis program. And so
Yeah.
I think there's been some confusion. In fact, Secure World Foundation put together a fact sheet on lunar initiatives, and we had a huge argument about like what exactly did you need to sign the Artemis Accords to be part of the Artemis program, and was one necessarily the other? And the Artemis program is the idea that they're going to put the United States wants to put the first, as they said, the first woman and first person of color back on the moon, and so it's limited. I think ESA is a for the Artemis program, and the Canadians and the Indians have finally signed on, and I think the UK as well. But that's different from the Artemis Accords. And Artemis Accords are just, a vision of peaceful exploration. And there are a lot of countries that have signed the Artemis Accords that do not even have space programs. So it's just more a way of demonstrating solidarity, I guess, with these issues. So I think that there is room for, shaping the peaceful uses of peaceful space exploration through these international partnerships, if it's a way of demonstrating a vision and again kind of indicating how the principles of the Outer Space Treaty apply in this new environment, or I should say, new activities, or how do they continue to evolve? So I think that can be very helpful for that. It doesn't necessarily mean
Yes.
that it will end up being that case, but it could be, and I'm hopeful that it will lead to, peaceful uses of space, and ensure that space is secure, safe, and sustainable for all over the long term.
Interesting. And we are coming at the end of the podcast, I would say, at the moment. So this last question is not related to our topic, because I believe every expert who gets kind of opportunity on this podcast has something to basically offer in terms of pointers or anecdotes to the people who are trying to make their way into the space industry, or who are already trying to pursue an education in the space domain, but aren't trying to find the right way to get into some of the domains like earth observation, space exploration, or launch segment. So this question is basically for the students, research scholars, and the people who are trying to basically make their way into the space industry. Basically for also the people who are from the non-space background. So from your perspective, what message would you like to give to the researchers, students, and the related people who are trying to make their way into the space industry?
Yeah, I mean, I would argue that space is not just for rocket scientists. There's
Yes.
room for all sorts of expertise and backgrounds and capabilities for that. And maybe I'm a little biased because, as I said, my degree is in political science. But I think you do
Yeah.
need,
Okay.
I'm like, oh, it's great. But you do
Yeah.
need political scientists. You need
Yeah.
economists.
Yeah.
You need ethicists.
Absolutely.
You need doctors. You need engineers, and clearly you need physicists. Like, I'm not downplaying
Yes.
that part, but I think there's a whole host of capabilities of looking at how, people that can enter the space sector. And then I would also argue right now, what we're seeing is there's so much space data being created, both in terms of Earth observation companies and SSA, data companies. It's almost more important to figure out how to use the data. Right.
Yes.
So you don't necessarily need, I think people say, I'm going to join the space sector. Okay. I need to figure out how to build a satellite. Not necessarily. Like, how can you use this this is where my scientific gigabytes, petabytes, whatever you're talking about, all that data that's coming in. How do you make it in a usable format? Because really and truly, if we can't figure out how to use that data, then it's not of use to us. And so that's where I would encourage people
Yes.
to start looking at how can you bring your specific interest and your specific set of capabilities and qualifications to ensure that you're helping make space, sustainable for all.
Absolutely. Yeah. So thank you very much, for this wonderful insights and the final message as well for the students, because there's a significant amount of students also listen to this podcast. Yeah, I believe there have been several questions which have popped up, especially I think the US-China relationship and the way it might even affect the supply chain or the overall dynamics of the way international cooperation and the UN setting operates. Basically, it will be basically interesting to host one more episode in the future, or in the near term also, whenever I think you are free, because I believe several of the questions have popped up, and it's not possible to answer each and every question in just the limited time that we have. So I hope in the future we will record more episodes, and I'm pretty sure your episode is going to receive a great response. So yeah, thank you very much, Victoria, again, for coming on the podcast and giving us your precious time. We hope to host you again in the future episodes.
Oh, it'd be my pleasure anytime. And for people who are interested in learning more, they can go to Secure World's website at swfound.org, or we're on LinkedIn, we're on Twitter. And yeah,
Yes.
I'm happy to keep this discussion going. Thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.